Hello, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to look at some of the techniques I use when I'm chopping up breaks to make one-shot sounds that I can then make into my own kits. Let's jump in. Okay, so thanks for asking. What lens are you using today, Conan? Today I'm using a vintage Russian lens called the Mir 1, and it's from 1966, which I think is a little bit mental that I'm making a video in 2025 with a lens that was made the last time England won the World Cup. But we won't go into that. So today we're going to look at chopping up breaks, some of the techniques that I use. They're not definitive. There are a million different ways to do it, but these are just some of the techniques that I use after, I don't know, nearly 35 or so years, maybe even nearly 40 years if I go back to my old Casio, of chopping up breaks and making one shots. So these are just some of the techniques that I use. So we have a break here in the MPC. Pretty average break. I actually got this off a late 70s jazz dance album, which is an album which instructs you how to dance. Now, if you're digging for tracks, or digging for records rather in a record shop, look out for those, like late 70s, early 80s, aerobics records, dance tutorial albums, anything like that. They almost always have open breaks on them. If not, they've got kind of funky music. If you like a bit of disco, sometimes some kind of really slow, dirty funk on there. I've found countless breaks just pulling out those albums, jazz dance, aerobics, that kind of thing, instructional albums, tutorial albums from that time period. So look out for those. So this is off one of those albums, late 70s. Can't remember exactly what it's called, Jazz Dance by so-and-so. Can't give everything away, can I? And it's, like I said, fairly average. There's lots of noise on it. It's a nice bit of crackly vinyl. And what I'm going to do today, to simplify things, I'm just going to chop out a kick, chop out a hi-hat, and chop out a snare drum. And I'm just going to show you some of the techniques that I use. Now, there's a fair amount of commitment when you do this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to be chopping the sample first, extracting the sample, and then maybe adding a few effects and things like that, just to polish it off. Because what I want to do is I want to create one shots that I can use and build my own drum kits with, to either use myself, maybe sell them, maybe give to another producer. But basically, you're going to be doing a lot of baking in effects, and you have to have, you have to make that commitment. You have to think, right, okay, I'm going to add this, I'm going to add that, then I'm going to flatten the pad. And I'll show you how to do that. But you can do it all in the MPC. Some people do it on their computer. I do sometimes, but I'm just going to show you how to do it on the MPC today. So the first thing that I do is I have a look at the sample. Obviously, you can see here it's a stereo sample, slightly biased to one side. What I generally do when I'm making one shots is I will sum it to the middle. If all the drums are over one side, obviously I'll just take that side, either or either. But on this one, you can see it's fairly balanced and it's slightly biased to one side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sum both. So what we'll do is we'll call that main mono, and then we'll sum that. So now at the top there, you'll now see that I'm working with this. Now, the sample had already been normalized. Now, when you mono sum a sample, what quite often happens is you lose a couple of dB. So I'm going to normalize that again. You don't have to do this. I've made a video on about normalizing. It's up to you. Just be aware of the fact, and I have explained this in numerous videos, that if you normalize, you're going to be increasing the peaks, but you're also going to be increasing the noise floor. So what I will be doing here is bringing up some of that vinyl noise as well. So that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's entirely your decision. So I'm just going to normalize that. And I've just made it front and center. The reason why I tend to do that for one shots is because most of the time with kicks and snares, they're going to be front and center anyway. So it's just a habit that I've got into doing. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's just how I do it. But you can run into issues later on if you're chopping up stereo samples and there's slightly biased reverb over one side, or, you can just run into issues. So I tend to mono. but it's source dependent. It depends. It's the case. It depends on what particular sound that you're cutting up. In this case, we've monoed it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start chopping out sounds that I want to use. And we said that today, just to simplify things, we're going to be chopping out a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat to help build our own kit. So if you listen to this break, you can hear there's a crash cymbal at the start. Now, to get nice clean sounds, generally what I want to do is I don't want the sound of any crash cymbals in there. So I would say roughly around here is when things start getting clean and we don't hear the crash cymbal anymore. Okay, but in terms of kicks, that's not the cleanest kick. So I'm going to take a snare first. If you've watched my video on trimming, you'll know what I'm doing here. But basically, I'm just going to trim out this sample. Make sure zero snap is on, which it is. That sounds pretty decent. Okay, and you can see that I've got a little bit of a hi-hat in there. I don't want that in there, so let's just zoom in on that. So there we have our snare drum, fairly clean. Still needs a bit of work. So what we'll do now, you don't want to discard in this situation because I want to keep the whole break because I want to chop out other parts of it. So again, I have actually made a video on this about whether you discard or extract. In this case, I want to extract, and we're going to call that, we don't need the main in there anymore. So let's just call that snare 1. Okay, so now you can see we've got snare 1. Okay, so now I want to take out a kick drum. I kind of like that one there, so let's just zoom in on that. Again, you can see that there's a hi-hat there that we don't want. Now, if you listen really, really carefully, if you've got headphones on, you can actually hear the pedal from the kick drum. It's just about here. And that is the sound of him lifting the pedal up, basically. I mean, maybe only I can hear that just because I've spent so many years chopping up beats and being a drummer myself and a sound engineer, so I've recorded a lot of drum kits in my time. But that's just you know, it doesn't really matter. I'm just pointing that out. That's the sound of the pedal. So, do I want that? No, I'm going to clean that up all the way. So I'm going to take that pedal out. So again, we want to extract, and this time we're going to call it kick 1. Okay, there we go. So you can see in here we've got kick 1 alphabetically. There it is. Okay, let's go back to our sample again, and now I want to take a hi-hat. I think it's going to be that one there, actually. That one looks like it might be the best one. Okay, let's just zoom in on that. You see zero snap is eliminating any clicks that I might have or pops at the start, which is really handy. Yeah, I want to get rid of that sounds pretty clean. But what I can tell you is if I was to normalize this, it's going to bring up a lot of noise floor. So I need to be aware of that. You quite often get that with hi-hats. So be careful with normalizing once you've actually chopped the sounds up, because what you're going to be doing when you normalize, when you've chopped the sounds up, is you're going to be normalizing them at different rates, because obviously if you normalize the entire sample, you're going to be normalizing to the highest peak, which is quite often going to be a snare or a kick. So once you've chopped up hi-hats, snares and kicks, there might be little ghost snares, little ghost kicks. When you normalize, you're going to be normalizing at different rates. So be aware of that. Generally, as a rule, I tend to normalize, if I'm going to normalize, right before I start. So everything is normalized at the same rate, basically. Yeah, just be wary of that. I could tell you right now, if I was to normalize this, there'd be a ton of noise floor brought up and vinyl sound. But that sounds pretty decent. I like that. And we will, of course, call that hat 1. Brain surgery. Right. Okay. So basically now we've got a snare drum, a kick drum, and a hi-hat. So what I want to do now is I want to start adding some effects, polishing up the sounds and turning them into more kind of like final one-shots that I can use in my drum kits. So if we go into Browse and we'll be in Sample Assign, you can see here, I have a drum track already set up, drum 001. That's just by default if you press New Project on your MPC, but you can build your drum tracks in any way you want, call them whatever you want. But just for this case, I tend to have my hats here. I tend to have my kicks there, and I tend to have a snare there. And that's how I tend to build my kits. Kicks, hats, snares. Not always, obviously, but generally. So if we now come out, you can see we're on drum track 1. There we have our 3 different sounds. But we want to do a little bit more work to those. So I'm going to go back into Sample Edit, and we're going to start with a kick. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, but what I want to do is I want to just add a tiny fade right at the end. So if you set the start and end points, you're not going to be able to hear much because there isn't much there, obviously. Now, if I go into Process, I can never remember where this is, Fade Out. What that's going to do is it's going to set a fade out in between the start and end points. So if we just do that, okay, let's open that up again. So all that's really done, it's very subtle, but what it's done is it's added a fade and just kind of clean things up again. You're probably going to hear it more with the snare because I purposely left a long tail on that. What I'm actually going to do is tighten that up a little bit because it is just a little bit more. Now, I don't want to extract here. I want to discard. Let's just make sure. Yeah, there we go. That's what I want to discard that. Now I'm going to add another fade. So that looks round about there. Let's go for that. Fade out. Okay. And you can hear what that's done is just cleared up the end, made it sound more like an actual professional one shot. And do we need to do anything with the hats? Always forget this in alphabetical. Yeah, actually, that could be cleaned up a little bit as well. Okay, so let's just discard that. See what I'm doing here, exactly the same process. Sorry, I have to forget that. I always forget that I have to pick that fade. Okay, and let's go back to fade out. And again, all I'm really doing there is just cleaning it up. So if we go back into main again now. Okay, so now at this point, I've tidied up the initial parts of the sample just by cutting off the tails, and I've made them nice and tight. And despite the fact that there was a lot of vinyl noise in there, now the way that I've tightened it up, trimmed it all off, you can't really hear that in there at all. Now, there's nothing wrong with having the vinyl sound in there. Obviously, some people really, really like that, but the purpose of this video really is to show you how to get nice, clean one-shots from your breaks. So the next part of the process is adding some effects, cleaning up the sounds, getting them to sound a bit more polished. Now, the decision on how much you want to polish them is entirely up to you. Like I said, there's no right or wrong here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the processes that I do, probably going to be pushing them to the extreme just a little bit, just to show you the process. You know, I wouldn't always do this, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it on these 3 particular drum sounds just to show you the process that I would normally go through. So what I want to do, remember when you're on drum tracks, down in the bottom right corner here, you can switch between showing the pad strip or the actual program strip, as we used to call it, but now it's track strip or whatever they want to call it now. I don't know. It changes every day. So you want it to be in pads, because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding individual effects to each pad. And the point of the exercise is I'm going to add the sounds, the effects to the pads, to the sound, and then I'm going to flatten it, which will then get rid of those effects, and it will bake in those effects to that sound. And that's what I was going on about, the fact that there's a certain amount of commitment when you do this, because you want to bake the effects in, because at the end you want a single one-shot sound that you're going to be making into a drum kit, be it to sell it, play it, etc. You don't want the original sound, the sound with some effects on it, which you then can't really play anywhere because you need your MPC to have those effects applied to it, etc. You get the picture. What I'm doing is showing you how to polish up the sound so that you can bounce it out of the MPC and you can use it anywhere that you want. So let's start with a kick drum. So we could probably add a little bit of EQ to that, just to give it a bit more low end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of, you're going to be thinking, well, what's he getting rid of stuff for? Going to get rid of the absolute lows, which you're probably not really going to be able to hear. I'm going to roll off some of the high end. So you can hear by doing that again, I've got rid of some of the hiss from the tape, from the original tape that it was taped on in the studio. Just cleaning it up a little bit. I think I might have just rolled off just a tiny bit too much. Yeah, that sounds better. Now what I want to do is I want to give it a little bit of bottom end. I don't want a shelf. I'm guessing the fundamental, I don't have a visual reference here, but I'm guessing the fundamental is probably around about 60. Make sure you turn the EQ on. I'll tell you this right now, despite the fact that I've been working in studios for over 40 years and have been behind mixing desks for that long, you would not know how many times I, myself, and other professional engineers that I'm sat with are adjusting an EQ or compressor, going, yeah, nodding our heads, yeah, this sounds good, yeah, this sounds good, and then seeing that it's not even turned on. Your ears and your brain can fool you into things sometimes. In fact, I've actually even done it with clients before. Sorry if you're one of those clients, but they've come in, they've sat behind the mixing desk, oh, I need more bass, and I've sat there with the bass EQ turned off, and I'm going like turning around looking at them, going, pulling the bass face, turning it up a little bit, and they're going, yeah, that's it, oh, you nailed it. And I haven't added any more bass at all, because in my opinion, if I'd have added more bass, it would have sounded crap. So I just pretended that I'd added bass. But be very, very careful of that. Make sure that you turn the EQ on, otherwise you'll be fooled. Does that sound about right? That's a bit low. It's about 67. And I'm just going to roll a tiny little bit of mud out of there. And that's more out of the tail of the kick. So that's just cleaning that up. Now with the kick drum, it doesn't really sound like I really need to do much more. You know, what I could do, for instance, let's do this just to show you what you can do. We're going to add a bit of reverb, because I've chopped that and I've made it quite tight, but let's say that I wanted to just give it back a little bit of life. Obviously not that much. Now, because I'm flattening it and I'm using it as an insert effect rather than a send effect, I want to take the mix right down. Still a little bit too much. I'm sorry if it annoys you that I don't use the Q links, but I've just always been a data wheel type person. What you also do when you add a bit of reverb, obviously, is give it a little bit of width. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave that on there so that you can hear adding effects and then committing. Okay, let's move on to the hi-hat. The hi-hat sounds like it needs a little bit of work in the EQ. Definitely getting rid of some of the low ends. Not too much. If you've watched some of my videos on EQing drums before, specifically hi-hats, I point out quite a lot that you don't want to roll off too much low end on a hi-hat because then it just sounds brittle. There's a nice little bit of body in a hi-hat sometimes. And also if you want it to sit with a drum kit, if you've chopped it off, chopped it out of, rather than it being in a drum machine, if you've chopped it out of a break or out of a live recording, if you roll off too much of the low end on the hi-hat, but you're not doing the same with the kick and the snare, it sounds fragmented. It doesn't, it loses that cohesion. So just bear that in mind when you're working with hi-hats. Don't take too much of the low end out. That's enough. And then I'm going to add a bit of brightness. And maybe, it sounds like maybe around about 250. There's a bit of mud in there. So that's without. And there we go, just clean that up. We won't add any reverb on there because I've shown you that in there. So no need to do any of that. Perhaps what we could do actually is add a little bit of transient, just to add a bit of attack at the start. You see how it gives the hat more of a sounds a little bit wishy-washy there. There it sounds more like a hat. It's going to cut through the mix. Okay, let's move on to the snare. Snare definitely needs some EQ. No, actually I'm going to do EQ first and then compression afterwards. I've been asked a few times by people why I will compress before EQ or EQ before compression. There's no definitive answer to that. It's entirely source dependent. Sometimes it needs to have the dynamic range reduced before I want to EQ it, so therefore I'll use compression first. Other times I won't want particular frequencies to affect the compression, so I'll EQ first. So there's no right or wrong answer, there's no definitive answer, and I think that's pretty much what I've said to people that have asked. It's source dependent. What you want to do is you want to learn your tools and learn the situation. So you'll listen to the sound, be it a break, instrument or whatever, and you'll listen to it and you'll think, I need to EQ that first, or I need to compress that first. Do it that way rather than thinking, oh, I've seen so-and-so EQ it first, so I'm going to do that every single time. There is no right or wrong answer. So we're going to EQ the snare drum a little bit first. I'm going to get rid of some low end. Again, not too much. See, that sounds a bit brittle now. That sounds around about enough. Definitely a bit of mud in there. As the mud was about 260 on the hat, chances are it's going to be around about the same on the snare, which it is. And a little bit, actually, I'm going to go around about 3.5. And let's just take that back a little bit. Just give it a bit of bite. Now this could also benefit from a little bit of transient work. So we'll go into a transient. Not too much. Just gives it a bit of bite. Very, very subtle. And then just a tiny little bit of punch with air compressor. That initial preset is ridiculous. I do not know what Akai were thinking. So you want to let the transient through. Don't want to nip on that. So 20 to 30 milliseconds is probably okay. And let's just take that back a little bit. I've lost a tiny little bit of volume there. It's subtle, but it's there. So it's adding punch. There's my kick. I never was very good at finger drumming. Anyway, so there we go. We've added some effects to our sounds, polished them up, made them sound a little bit more like a polished one-shot kit. Now what I want to do is I want to flatten the pads, because those effects are not baked in yet at the moment. They're just added to the actual pad sound. I need to be able to export these particular sounds. We're not going to go into that in this video, by the way. I'm just showing you some of my techniques of actually chopping up and stuff. So I'm not going to go into the whole export, build a drum kit, all that kind of stuff. That could be a different video entirely. So In MPC 3, when you want to flatten a pad now, you go into Program Edit. And you see each time I hit a drum, it changes here. And that's the pad. Now to flatten, it's this button up here. Okay, and literally it's going to be writing a new sample, because now you can see it's bounces beat kick 2. You can turn it into whatever, name it however you want. You can also add a tail. If you've got some reverb on there, it's a good idea to add a little bit of a tail. Again, it's entirely up to you, and you can experiment. You can have some fun with it. Actually, if you've got a tail on it and you want to chop it off so it kind of forms a kind of gated reverb, you can do that here. Say it had like a 1.5 seconds of reverb and you want to chop that reverb, do 1 second tail. So you have to kind of experiment. There's not going to be any need for tails. I'm going to leave a tail on the kick, but on those ones I'm not going to. So okay, that's now made a new kick drum with those effects. So if I now open that up in a second, which I will do, but I'm just going to flatten everything else first. So let's flatten this hat. Do the same again. And then do the same with the snare drum. Okay, so what's happened there is it has automatically written those flatten pads onto the original pads that they were on. But for comparison, if I go into Browse and Sample Assign, what I can do is drop the original on here, kick one there, snare one there. Okay, so these are the versions that I've flattened with the effects on them. Now, just as I said right at the very, very start, this is subtle. You know, I'm not going to absolutely go over the top because it's pointless. So I've done a bit of subtle work with EQ, compression, transient, a little bit of reverb on the kick, and it just polished them off. So we'll compare them. So both are still really, really good. I still like them. But it's just added a little bit of a dimension, a little bit of a volume drop in that one. This one, the hi-hat, to me, is way better. Just by adding a bit of transient and a bit of EQ. I mean, that hi-hat sounds pretty rubbish. That's much better. With the kick drums, I like them both. I may even prefer the original. With the snare drum, you can hear that it's just got a little bit more bite, and I've taken out some of the mud. If you listen to the original, it's kind of got a woo woo. That's kind of around about 250. But as you can hear from that, I've just basically taken the one shots, just polished them off. So there you have it. You know, obviously there's a lot more that you can do with those individual sounds. I just really kind of wanted to show you the technique rather than, you know, there's a lot more work that I would have done on those sounds, to be honest. Probably wouldn't have added the reverb on the kick, but I just wanted to show you that you can do that and bake it in if you wanted to add some room reverb or whatever to your sounds. Or you can do the same with delay, anything like that. It's entirely up to you what effects you add on there. You know, you can build yourself a whole drum kit with phase sounds on there if you want, or a drum kit with really, really tight slapback delay on them. You know, it's entirely up to you. But I just wanted to show you the technique. And that's what I do with breaks. I'll go through the breaks individually, and I would chop the sounds out, extract them out, and build my own drum kits. Make them nice and polished, or don't polish them off. You know, leave the vinyl noise, bring up some of the noise floor, bring up some of the tape hiss. There is no right or wrong. I just wanted to show you the techniques that I use just to build one-shot drum kits. So thanks for watching. My name's Conan. This is the Crates Motel. I can't remember if I said that in the right order. Till next time.